Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. This is another one of those kind of in the moment, crisis led sort of episodes. Um, Before we get into it, I'm going to talk about NATO and its imminent demise, quite possibly. And its past, and its history, and its founding, and a whole bunch of stuff in between. Um, Before we get into it, just some housekeeping, some announcements. So obviously we use a little bit of ad revenue, the little bit we get, to keep the podcast going. If you don't like adverts, and let's face it, who does? Switch over to Patreon now, and you can listen to every episode ad free. I will be hopefully, when the moment takes me, be able to backload legacy episodes, the many hundreds that there are, onto Patreon. But for now, we're starting a fresh page, so everything from January 26 onwards is going to be ad free over on Patreon. I'm also throughout the week going to add a little video here and there over on Patreon, so do go and check it out. And before we go any further, let's talk about our masterclasses that are coming up. So on Sunday, the 26th of January, we'll be doing a Russia masterclass from 1917, the Russian Revolution, all the way through to the Stalin era. It's there for students of the period who are at A level or that kind of tier, wherever you are in the world, who are looking to go beyond just listing the facts and listing the dates and hoping for the best, and instead really wanting to delve into argument, structuring arguments that are going to give you the best chance of getting those top marks, and also being able to master the art form of argument and debate and structuring evidenced arguments, the kinds of things that examiners want to see. We'll be looking at going inside the examiner's mind and being able to look at what the examiner is looking for, but also getting inside your own headspace too, and exploring those important blocks that we all have from time to time that keep us from really doing our best. So get the ticket now, because there's 100 we've allocated, and they're going to go. So make sure you dive in on that to avoid disappointment. And there's a link below. Grab that and get your ticket, and we'll see you for the live session on the 26th of January. Okay, so to the key question of NATO. Before we go into its likely demise, let's just talk about what it is, what it has been. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was forged in 1949 at a moment of intense vulnerability during the early years of the Cold War. 1949 is a key year. It's a year where a number of things happen. The two biggest, that the Soviets acquired a nuclear weapon. They'd actually done that slightly earlier, but 1949 is the year we knew. And then also China falls to the communists. And by this point, Stalin's takeover of Eastern Europe is complete. It was complete really in 1948. And the first kind of conflict over the fate of Western Europe has also been kind of won by the Western Allies, and that is the Berlin Airlift. In 1949, Germany is formally divided, and a new state in the West is established, and incorporated into NATO, a new military alliance, which confirmed to Stalin in his most suspicious thinking everything that he believed was likely to happen. He thought a kind of a rearmed West Germany, backed now by the real villains, the British and the Americans, the kind of the heart of the capitalist system, would be resupplied and sent to attack the Soviet Union. Um, and there were reasons for his paranoia, some fairly justifiable ones too. 1947 was this kind of year of decision, year of kind of crisis almost for Truman. And it was the year where Britain really bows out of its world role. It can't afford to police the various anti-communist movements that it is managing, particularly in Greece. The British have been involved in Greece since about 1944 when the Germans pull out. Greece descends into civil war between the royalists and the communists, and the British intervene. Stalin doesn't really care about Greece one way or another. Greece was a kind of Churchillian obsession, and the British intervene in order to support the royalists. And they do up until 1947 when they can't afford it any longer. And when Truman realizes the British, partly as a result of America's kind of uh, economic pressure placed on Britain, due to the demands for kind of currency convertibility, the British have to, they can't afford to carry on with their policing role in Greece. The British have also lost their largest source of manpower in the guise of the Indian Army. That was probably inaccessible to them from at least 1946 onwards, and so the British power, the ability to fight wars and fund wars, takes a significant nosedive. And Truman actually expressed regret eventually that he thought that financially pressurizing Britain was one of the most short-sighted things that he'd ever done. He could have allowed the British to carry on being the sort of like the vanguard power against the Soviet Union. Well, how long that would have lasted is hard to say. And Truman passes in 1947 the National Security Act, and he, in doing so, has to use the Truman Doctrine speech to scare Americans out of complacency and the tendency to shift back towards isolationism. So the foundations of NATO are emerging in this period of time, but NATO itself doesn't emerge till 1949, and the context there is obviously the development of a kind of a bloc in Eastern Europe between 45 and 48. He'd already had by this point obviously, as I said, the Truman Doctrine and also the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe as a kind of a stable capitalist bloc. And there was no kind of binding military agreement. The classic British formulation was it was designed to keep the Soviets out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. And the British were highly concerned that the Americans would disappear into isolationism, and the British were, and the Americans already had. By late 1945, plans for kind of like a second Dunkirk drawn up. If the Soviets decided they were going to march all the way to to Calais, basically. So the drawdown of troops in Western Europe is quite in the West for the British and the Americans and Allies is quite rapid. American servicemen, British servicemen, Canadian servicemen, they all want to go home. And the size of the Red Army remains formidable. So between 1948 45 and 48, the USSR sponsored or pressured the establishment of communist regimes across Eastern Europe and created Cominform in 1947 to coordinate these parties and keep them aligned with Moscow. A communist coup in Czechoslovakia in February 48, which toppled one of the last remaining pluralist democracies in the region, had a profound psychological effect in Western capitals, reinforcing the fear that the salami slicing of Eastern Europe could soon extend westwards. It was, a moot point whether Austria would go. The coup and Soviet pressure on Finland and elsewhere pushed France and other previously hesitant states towards demanding a concrete military alliance, not just economic aid or political declarations. So from March 1948, Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg signed the Treaty of Brussels, a mutual self-defense pact aimed at possible German revival and Soviet pressure. So at this point, it's not an absolute given that Germany is trusted or a known quantity, and German revival or return to fascism is as equal a worry as the threat of the Soviet Union. Almost immediately, secret Pentagon negotiations in Washington between the US, the United Kingdom, and Canada explored options ranging from extending the Brussels Treaty to a new Atlantic alliance, culminating on the 1st of April 1948 in the so-called Pentagon Paper, which became the internal blueprint for what would become NATO. The key question in these talks was how far the United States was willing to go in and commit itself in peacetime to automatic or near automatic defense obligations in Europe, a major break with its pre-1941 traditions of avoiding permanent alliances. So NATO in 1949 is quite a kind of an aberration as far as American doctrine goes. It's not a thing that America traditionally does.
So here's the thing with homemade meals. Eating them is great, but all the chopping and measuring and cleanup, not so much. With new one-pan assemble and bake meals from Blue Apron, you get all the flavor of homemade meals with a fraction of the work. Just assemble the pre-chopped ingredients, bake in the oven, and enjoy. Shop, assemble, and bake at BlueApron.com. Get 50% off your first 2 orders with code APRON50. Terms and conditions apply. Visit BlueApron.com/terms for more.
From June 1948 to May 1949, the Soviet Union imposes a blockade on Berlin. The Berlin blockade, imposed by the USSR after Western powers fused their German zones together and moved towards creating a West German state, further sharpens the sense of urgency. The blockade and the Western response via the Berlin Airlift convinced many policymakers that Western Europe needed not only economic recovery but a standing institutionalized framework for joint defense with clear US participation and planning. The end of the blockade in May 1949 came just weeks after the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty, underlining how NATO was conceived in the midst of a very real crisis over access to Berlin and the future of Germany. On the 4th of April 1949, 12 states, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg and the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom and the United States signed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in North Atlantic Treaty in Washington, D.C. The treaty's core was a political military bargain. The United States agreed a peacetime security guarantee to Western Europe. In return, Europeans committed to mutual defense, political consultation, and the gradual development of integrated defense planning. Article 5's commitment that an armed attack against one was to be considered an armed attack against all was deliberately worded to create both deterrent ambiguity and political flexibility, binding enough to reassure Europeans, but still leaving room for US constitutional procedures and alliance deliberation. NATO's founding documents and early rhetoric cast the alliance as a defensive association of free democratic states against the possibility of aggression, contrasting with the emerging Soviet-dominated Eastern Bloc. In practice, NATO was one pillar of a broader Western strategy that combined economic reconstruction, political consolidation, moves towards West German statehood, for example, and military integration to contain Soviet power and prevent both communist advances and German remilitarization. The alliance was thus both a response to immediate episodes of crisis, the Czechoslovak 1948 coup and the Berlin blockade, and a structural decision to embed US power permanently in the security architecture of Western Europe. Okay, so that's part of the story. And obviously, during the Cold War period, containment of the Soviet Union stretched to Seato in Southeast Asia and Sento, involving, I think it's Turkey, Iraq, Iran before the 79 revolution, Pakistan, and a kind of to create a buffer of states to the Soviet Union's kind of South Asian, Central and South Asian flank. Kennedy had B-52s flying around the clock around the Soviet Union for years, and the Soviet Union, the military planners of the Soviet Union looked at the kind of the plethora of military bases around it, and China had the same experience, and their view is that this is a kind of a constant knife at our throats. They don't see it as a defensive alliance at all. So NATO, after the end of the Cold War, transforms significantly. It grows, and particularly under George W. Bush, it grows up to the borders of the Soviet Union. Eastern European states join NATO. Baltic states join NATO, and it's a completely separate podcast. The debates around Ukraine and NATO and the causes of the war. I'm not going down that one right now because we'll be here for longer than I anticipated. Put it that way. But obviously the critics of NATO point out about NATO's involvement in America's 9/11 wars, in Afghanistan, and the NATO basically destruction of Libya, which has caused untold chaos, misery, suffering, and loss of life. And but kind of in the Trump era, you have politicians in the UK, the likes of Zach Palansky from the Green Party, talking about not necessarily leaving NATO, but a restructured NATO, perhaps without America, citing the rather obvious truth that Trump has proposed leaving NATO consistently. Instead of seeing a kind of a Pax Americana that benefits America, he looks at things transactionally, says we do all this for them, we get nothing in return. And particularly, I get nothing in return. Where who is lining my pockets? And so there has been this kind of gradual pressure on NATO. Democrat and Republican politicians alike have griped for decades that European countries don't pay their defence bills and instead fritter away money on things like social welfare. And well, there is something to that. And it's been a long-standing American resentment. Mainly, the thing that America was able to buy in Europe with its defense guarantees was political influence. And Trump is obviously kind of maxing that credit card out at the moment by simultaneously economically attacking Europe, politically attacking it, and his new national security strategy threatening to replace European democracies with far-right governments, and humiliating Europe as much as possible, at the same time saying, because of our security guarantee, we are able to do this. We are able to, if we pulled out tomorrow, best of luck with Ukraine. You'll have the Russians in Warsaw before you know it. And so he's able to use that leverage, and this is what Trump does. He has not forgotten a single thing that Roy Cohn in those kind of sleazy days of the 1980s taught him. So Trump has little interest in NATO anyway. He doesn't see the future of a Pax Americana. He sees a world of rival, competing great powers where he will have chats and horse trading agreements with people like Vladimir Putin, and say things like, well, you can do what you want in Ukraine if you give us carte blanche to betray, to do what we want in Venezuela. We crack on and betray your man Maduro, who supported you. And so the place we're at today is when you have a dozen or so European leaders standing up saying, Trump, you must not. Well, they haven't exactly said this, but they've strongly hinted it that Greenland is sovereign territory of Greenland and Denmark and the Greenlanders and the Danes, and should not be interfered with in any way. They haven't used the word America or Trump in the statement at all, but one doesn't really need to read between any lines to understand what they are saying. And this is really unique for a kind of a generation of particularly supine and spineless politicians. I mean, Keir Starmer is one of them, for heaven's sakes, and they have obviously thought quite hard, I would imagine, about the consequences, of which there will be significant consequences. Trump will be livid, I would imagine, and I would be surprised if something doesn't now happen with Greenland. Not necessarily as a result of this statement. I think that something is going to happen anyway, and that will be the end of NATO. And in no uncertain terms, it is impossible for a military alliance to continue where the largest player in that alliance starts to annex territories belonging to a smaller power. It is inconceivable. This will, of course, be music to Putin's ears. I believe he will look at the situation and be scarcely able to kind of imagine how well things have gone for him. The removal of NATO, not just from his borders, but from its entire existence, is a coup of coups. And what this means for the international order next, what remains of it, is kind of anyone's guess. I would imagine very quickly a European Defence Alliance will be formed, and I think this probably will involve Great Britain. The extent to which Britain will further reintegrate with Europe is a moot point. And again, that's a subject for a different podcast. Anyway, I'm going to leave you there in a moment, but I hope you find that a useful one today. And please check out either our or both, in fact. If you want to get these episodes without adverts, check us out on Patreon, and also come along to the masterclass. It's going to be brilliant. Take good care, folks. All the best. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.